Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from the break and welcome to this penultimate session of the workshop on the subject. This session is on the subject of lessons from cohesion policy for recovery in Europe. I think everyone would agree we've had an extremely interesting day. We've gained insights to a complex mix of challenges facing the EU, short-term recovery, building resilience against future shocks, structural reforms, and longer-term rising territorial inequality. The discussions are focused on the policy choices being made, or those that should be made, to promote the green and digital transitions. And we've covered, among other things, the role of conditionalities, whether there is the institutional capacity to deliver on investment priorities and reforms, and some of the methodological and data challenges for monitoring and evaluating EU instruments in the new period. And our purpose in this session is to focus on the role of cohesion policy, picking up from the discussion that we've just heard on how to respond to the major territorial impacts of the major trends and challenges that face us. Well, for this session, we have a first-class panel of experts, and taking them in turn, I'm very pleased to welcome Dijkstra, who is the head of the economic analysis sector of DG Regio in the European Commission. He's the editor of the Cohesion Report, which must be one of the most interesting jobs in DG Regio, analysing economic, social and environmental issues in EU regions and cities. Also pleased that we're joined by Vassilis Monastiriotis, who's an economist and economic geographer, specialising in labour economics, economic geography and political economy. He's director of the LSE Research Unit on Southeastern Europe and has affiliations with LSE's Department of Geography and Environment and the Hellenic Observatory. Also very pleased that we're joined by Guido De Blasio, who is an economist at the Banca of Italy. He's worked mostly on regional and urban economics issues and is now coordinating the Banca of Italy's research projects on the impact of climate change on the Italian economy. Another really interesting challenge. Also pleased to welcome Maria-Varinia Michalun, who is acting head of the Governance of Regional Development Unit at the OECD, where she leads studies dedicated to multi-level governance, the governance of cohesion policy funds, regional innovation policy, and industrial transition for regional development. Last but not least, I'm very pleased to welcome Marco Percoco, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Social and Political Sciences at Bocconi University and Director of the Green Research Centre, with research interests including transport and economic geography. I'll invite each of our panelists to make an opening statement, and then we'll open up the debate for the panelists to respond to each other, but also to our wider participants. So please do feel free to use the chat if you've got questions for any of our panelists, or if you've got comments that you'd like to make on any of the issues that are raised. Well, so without any further ado, let me give the floor to Lewis for our first panelist contribution. Lewis.
Thank you, John. So over to me to make a couple of quick remarks, and to keep me on time, I will set a timer so you don't have to listen to me waffle on forever. So timer started. Here's my 6 minutes. So title of my intervention is How to Recover What You've Never Had, What We've Never Had. I mean, in the end, that's what we're talking about. That's what we're trying to achieve, both with the RRF and with cohesion policy. We're trying to come out of this massive recession, all the restrictions of the pandemic, to a situation where we've never been before, and to go far beyond that, right? We've heard this morning about all the efforts to make large, really large scale changes, not just tinkering, but massive changes in the institutions, especially the public institutions, by digitalizing them, making them more efficient, making them more transparent, and allowing the business environment to improve, and hopefully stimulating a lot more entrepreneurship. And here's one of the key differences, and Eric from Brescia highlighted that really, between the two instruments. The Recovery Resilience Fund pays upon performance. It pays upon whether you reached your goal. And that has a big benefit, is that you can tackle cheap, difficult problems. And fixing institutions doesn't cost enough money. You know, high-speed rail, urban wastewater treatments, you know, multi-lane highways, that costs money. So there you can make a big impact directly and also indirectly. The difficulty with institutional changes, it costs the most expensive thing on earth. It costs political capital. And apparently we need to put a lot of funding up to ensure that people are willing to use that political capital. But I'm personally extremely excited and optimistic about all the changes that have been proposed as part of the RRF. And as a result, our expectation and the research has shown that if we improve the institutional setting, the impact of cohesion policy will also be far greater. In previous cohesion reports, we've argued that you can't spend your way out of poor quality institutions. You need to fix them before you really can improve that situation. So that's the good news. And that's on the institutions. And we might not get there in one go, but I really feel like this big push could have a really systematic impact and create a break with the problems that we've been facing in the past. But talking about the green and the digital transition, like Andres just did, is of course more challenging. And in many ways, it turns around this classic political science question, who pays, right? So if we're talking about digitalization, one part of that answer and one part of the EU's ambition is to make sure that we have not just broadband, but really very high speed internet access everywhere. Every household, every firm can access very high speed internet. And the question there, who pays, is very clear. It's us, it's the public sector, it's the EU, it's the nation states who are going to subsidize the rollout of very high speed internet to locations where private companies aren't sure they'll make a sufficient return. So there's a positive element, because then we'll see a much bigger difference in terms of the number of households and the number of firms who could access the internet. Of course, the next question is, will they? And there it comes to providing the skills, the training, and the incentives for them to really profit from that opportunity that we're providing. So there, again, I am fairly optimistic. The green transition is really the challenge of our lifetime. It's the biggest change we have to make to our societies and to our economies, and it's not going to be easy. I think once we're there in that zero carbon economy, things will be much easier, but that transition is not necessarily going to be smooth. We are trying to tackle this through different angles. We've got the emission permits for all the emissions inside the EU as part of the emissions trading scheme, but that's a limited part of the economy and it's a limited share of overall emissions. We're now talking about putting up a border tax to avoid emissions leaking out by producing things abroad and then importing the final products. But the other sectors are the ones which worry me more. Housing, buildings, how to make the existing stock more efficient. In the regions that are the poorest, I would expect the housing to be least insulated, least energy efficient. And there it's unclear who's going to pay. It's probably the owner of the building or the tenant, who either will have to pony up a large investment up front or suffer increasing energy costs as time goes by. So that's a challenge, and that's part of the challenge that you see in a lot of the discontent that Andres and I have worked on before. When it comes to transport, the key sector which has failed to contribute to the reductions of greenhouse gas emissions stands for a massive challenge. Now, some locations we have alternatives. We can actually get on a bike, like I do when I go to work, if I go to work. Well, pandemic's almost over, but in a city, you can take a bus or you can take a metro and go for a low carbon mode, but those options aren't available everywhere. So I think the capacity to shift modes, the capacity to reduce how much you need to travel varies dramatically across our territories. And my concern is that the more remote, the more rural, and the less affluent locations are going to suffer most from those consequences. I was going to say maybe one more thing. I think for manufacturing and services, the challenges are very different, but it's very hard to predict. I am not ready to say that it's going to be the less developed regions who are going to be hit hardest when it comes to making manufacturing and services low carbon. It might be that that is a wait and see situation. So my 6 minutes are up. Thank you for listening, and I'll happily answer questions later. Over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Lewis. Great opening statement and a lot of food for thought there. Let's go straight on then to Vassilis. Vassilis.
Yep. Thanks, John, and thanks for everybody for joining. My intervention will focus on 3 notes on guided development. That's my title, and I will talk about synergies, conditionality, and capacities, all in 6 minutes, I hope. So the first point I want to make is about synergies, that often, both in cohesion policy, but in EU policy in general, we tend to put too many eggs in one basket and to try to achieve too many objectives with one stone. So the Recovery and Resilience Fund also has this idea about restructuring, transformations, transition to green and digital economy. But we need not forget that it is also, or the trigger for that has been the need for recovery, for economic recovery, for the multiple crises that seem to hit the continent, if you want, and the EU in the last more than 10 years. So recovery requires often what we know also from outside cohesion policy, requires interventions that are often pure subsidies. They're not necessarily looking for economic efficiency, but they try to treat the demand side and try, if you want, helicopter money is one idea that comes in. It's not about efficiency, it is about quick action to deal with issues. Restructuring, transformations require much more long-term goals. And then here you can ask, is the objective of 2026 sufficient long run when you think about green economy and digital economy? So this upgrading requires a long-term process that targets the supply side. So this is a thing that we have to always keep in mind, I think. On the second point, which is about conditionality, and we have the term conditionality a lot in this conference, and quite celebrated also, I think, in the first panel that we had, the fact that we have conditional release of funds is considered as very important. I think, again, what I want to say is that, of course, when we do development, what we want to do is to improve targeting, to target specific sectors, locations, activities, whatever, and to mobilize resources, mobilize inert resources, and through that also resolve market failures, I suppose. Now, often these are hindered by things that we had before, institutional quality, corruption, possibly, also material constraints on the ground. And for this, you do need conditionalities. But I am a bit skeptical about what level of conditionality. Of course, you have the project conditionality, the program conditionality, but when it comes to having essentially assistance, recovery assistance and restructuring, conditional on reforms that are often disputed even in policy, in the policy world. So, for example, pension reforms, in what direction, at what pace, at what cost. And then you make the green transition or the digital transition, or indeed the economic recovery, conditional on that. That is something that inevitably also politicizes the issue. And I come from Greece and I know a lot about politicization of conditional assistance since the Eurozone crisis. So politicizes the issue and doesn't buy in the agents, exactly the ones that you want to mobilize in order to support development. And then on the third point, essentially we led to that, is capacities. And of course, we talked again a lot about capacities. And I want to highlight 2 things here. One is the capacity, where do you focus capacity building? And one is building new capacities versus building on existing capacities. And often what we see from the literature on cohesion policy that I'm aware of, is that you get a lot of variation, you get a lot of your information from the successful cases, which tend to be cases with good capacities. And these cases tend to invest in the good potential and to enhance them. But if you look at the underperformers, the implication that they should focus on their existing capacities is sometimes quite counterintuitive, because if the capacities were good enough, if the specializations were good enough, they would be performing better anyway. So what you really need here is to find complementary specializations, complementary new activities that can fit to the existing ecosystem, but also take it further, allow it to grow. The other dimension to that, of course, is whether we focus on material capacities, the bridges and the factories and the capital in deprived areas, versus we're talking about institutional capacity. So as we said, quality of government and so forth. And I think in both cases, we have to recognize that these things have to happen simultaneously. And as a consequence, there will be some deadweight loss and there will be some inefficiency. You cannot wait to build the bridge until the south of Italy has become Milan or Germany, and you cannot wait to likewise, you first build all the bridges and all the airports, and then you look at the public administration and the inefficiencies there, or sort of areas of institutional weaknesses, both formal and informal. So these things have to come together, and because they have to come together, there will be inefficiencies. Now that takes me back to the issue of conditionality. So if you tighten up too much your conditionality, you end up penalizing those with low capacities and essentially rewarding those with high capacities, because those with high capacities can meet, can set good targets, meet the conditions, get the money. And then this is, my final point, this is the whole question about cohesion policy and about anything that the EU does. On the one hand is the objective of territorial cohesion and social cohesion, so redistribution in a way and equity. On the other hand is efficiency, moving into the future with digital economy, green economy and so forth. And that takes me to my very first point. Sometimes you cannot kill two birds with one stone, and you may need more than one stone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vassilis. A lot of interesting points there about the policy response. I'm sure we'll be coming back to some of those as we go through the debate. Okay, let's go then straight on to Guido De Blasio. Guido?
Hi, John. Hello, everybody. Let me first thank Riccardo and Mara for having me in this very interesting panel. I will try to distill a very few lessons from the EU cohesion policy on some aspects that I believe might be more relevant for the recovery plans. So clearly, my views are mostly based on the case of Italy, and as you know, the case of Italy has its peculiarity, meaning that we have had massive effort on cohesion, at least since the end of World War II, with very little results. So this is bad, but this also means that probably the external validity of the things that I'm going to say will be not so high. So the first point that I want to make is that the experience that we have tells us that public expenditure do not necessarily deliver economic growth, not even massive public expenditure will do the job. And also we have a lot of EU evaluations that makes at least three very important points. The first point is that we have a lot of heterogeneity. Okay, we have heterogeneous effects. That means that the same policy will deliver different results when applied to different regions. The second point I want to make is that most of the effect that has been found for the European regions regarding the EU cohesion policies are short-term effects. Okay, for instance, while the policy itself it intends to foster self-sustaining growth. For instance, we have a paper by Becker et al. And Baron et al. And they show that the impacts are not very long-lived, meaning that when the program ends, okay, the regions tend to go back to the area of underdevelopment. The third point that I would make is that we also have a lot of evidence of a number of unwanted effects of the regional policy. Okay, so we know that the regional policy might have bad effect on the local endowment of civicness and social capital. We know that the regional policy can be used for corruption instead of enhancing growth. We also know that in some cases the money of regional policies has been used by the organized crime. So the question that we have to ask now is why we think that now it should be different. And on this question, and now I can say something more on a positive side. I believe that at least for two important drivers of effectiveness we are going in the right direction. The first point is related to the local institutional quality. Okay, this is something that we have talked a lot this morning, and also something that has been mentioned by Lewis and Vassilis. We know that local institutional quality is hard, is very hard to build, especially in the short term. Okay. What is the implication of this? One implication is that probably at this stage, decentralization is not the right move. This means that when the local of the quality of the local administration is low, probably we want to go first with technical assistance, and only later we want to go with the money. I had a look at the recovery plan of Italy, and I liked a lot the fact that the recovery plan of Italy has a lot of emphasis of coordination and technical assistance. I do believe that this is a crucial step in the right direction. Clearly, we have to be careful here, because we don't have to exceed in try to re-centralize stuff back to Rome. Probably we have to think that there are some local authorities that are able to manage the money, and we should leave all the responsibility at that level, while we also know that there are some other local authorities that will be not able to manage the money. At that point, some form of centralization is required. And clearly, making distinction between local administration is very difficult. It's politically very difficult. That probably this is here there is some room for our EU partners to jump in and provide a proper advice. The second thing that I want to second point I want to make is that we also know that some general nationwide policies, they can interact with the programs at the local level. This is famous paper by Boeri, Kino, Moretti, and others that they show basically that the nationwide wage regulation, the centralized bargaining in Italy, has worked against the interests of the South, meaning that firms do not invest in low productivity areas because they have to pay anyway the same salary that they will pay in a high productivity area. And we have a lot of OECD, Bank of Italy evidence of the fact that the public sector, for instance, the schooling system, the procurement system, the judiciary, they have huge differences between the North and the differences in performance between the North and the South. So the structural reforms are a key component of the national plan. This is true everywhere, but it's particularly true for Italy. And I was very pleased this morning to hear from America on Brexit that the Italian recovery plan envisages a central role for reforms, and he explicitly said that the reforms should come first and the money should come only later. And I think that my 6 minutes are already over. Thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Guido. Going very much to the heart of why cohesion policy doesn't work in certain areas and contexts. And again, a lot of food for thought. Let's go on then to Varinha Michalun. Varinha.
Thank you, John, and thank you to everyone participating today. I think we're going to hear a little bit of a different perspective from me than from what Guido just presented, because really what I'd like to do is highlight this particular lesson with respect to cohesion policy on the concept of needing to reinforce the role of regions in cohesion policy, and for this, governance definitely matters. And there are 3 points that I'd like to emphasize here. First is the importance of a differentiated and regionally appropriate response. And the reasons behind this are numerous and varied, but 3 in particular is the continuing need to catch up. There are still inequalities, not only at the NUTS 2 level, and in fact, NUTS 2 level inequalities seem to be shrinking, but NUTS 3 level inequalities are increasing. At least we're seeing this among OECD countries. We're seeing it particularly since 2010, and especially in non-metropolitan areas. So those that don't necessarily benefit as much from globalization as metropolitan regions. So intra-regional disparities are increasing. The other point within this is that COVID-19 has had a very asymmetric impact on regional economies within countries. It has had an asymmetric impact on economies in general, as we know, and it has highlighted some very structural weaknesses, such as in healthcare and housing, with respect to demographic change, with digital gaps across metropolitan and rural areas. And there's a large, what we're seeing are the consequences of a decade of underinvestment in regions and municipalities, as well as some really significant coordination challenges among levels of government and institutional quality issues as well. COVID-19 has accelerated megatrends such as digitalization, and it's leading governments also to rethink the spatial equilibrium between or across urban and rural regions. So really to start thinking more and more in terms of functional areas. And the last point in this, in terms of a need for a differentiated response, is trust in government, because a lack of social cohesion, unbalanced territorial development, and dissatisfaction with government services and the economy can result in further declines of trust in government at the regional level. And as we know, trust is critical not only for crisis management and recovery like the COVID-19 pandemic, but also for generating compliance with broader policies for managing larger global challenges such as climate change or greening or digitalization. The second point I'd like to bring up with respect to cohesion policy in this lesson is that it's really important to have a regionally adapted approach to regional development through cohesion policy. It's important to make sure that cohesion policy is reflecting regional and local realities, needs, and capacities. Yes, it does need to ensure that national objectives and international aims are met, but not ignoring that different regions need different things. And so if all regions are confronted with having the same priorities and achieving them in the same way, we really need to question, is that regional development? So a territorially appropriate approach to cohesion policy and in design and implementation can depend significantly on the degree to which regions are empowered to set their objectives and priorities and identify how they're going to reach these, of course, within the parameters of national level objectives. What we're seeing and have been seeing is a significant trend towards decentralization in most OECD countries over the past 50 years, and it touches almost all policy areas. At the same time, we're seeing a trend of upscaling, so a stronger role for regions in regional policy, and this has some very this has become a really prominent issue for implementing and funding regional development policy. So what does this mean for cohesion policy? I think that we need to consider cohesion policy if it remains sort of centralized, or if it is re-centralized, or if it stays as a top-down exercise in terms of design and implementation. We're not only moving against these trends, but we're also potentially affecting the ability of cohesion policy to address inequalities at the NUTS 3 level. And my final point has to do in this overall lesson, has to do with the need to really think about the multi-level governance systems that are supporting recovery and supporting cohesion policy. It may sound a little bit wishy-washy, but and that's not the intention. But really, I think that a strong partnership approach to strategic programming for cohesion policy and recovery and resilience is going to be fundamental. And this means that the national and the regional levels really need to work together. They need to talk to each other. They need to respect each other. And there's a fundamental, this is a fundamental component to being able to design and implement a regionally appropriate response. I'd like to pick up on this notion of implementation. Implementation capacity is fundamental. It's not only capacity of institutions, but then it's also the capacity to actually apply the policy and manage funds. So it's much more micro in that respect. And finally, I think that cohesion policy programming, just transition fund programming, recovery and resilience programming, these need to be considered from a governance perspective in a coordinated manner. I think they're going to work best if they are considered complementary areas and complementary aspects or channels of funding rather than individual or separate. And in this way, they can better support a country's and region's development not only in the immediate, but also, and to overcome COVID-19, but also for greater resilience once the crisis has passed, which hopefully is now. And we continue to address these long-term global challenges, such as the need for greening, digitalization, and climate change. So this is also a governance issue, and I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Varinha. A lot of key messages there that I think we'll want to pick up. And finally, let me give the floor to Marco. Marco.
Yeah, thank you. I will share my screen. I have just one slide, I promise you. Okay, I guess you can see now. Well, I have some very loose thoughts coming from maybe management science view, which is very far from my ground. But usually, I mean, over the past years, I didn't agree very much with Guido, for example. I also have my background from Italy, so I knew that cohesion policy didn't work very well in this nation. I mean, especially in the South. But still, I had my view focused on the 90s, for example, so the 90s years. And when I started collecting some evidence regarding the 2000 years, and then discovered that cohesion policy was not working very well, especially in the south of Italy in terms of GDP growth, so especially in the short run, I started to figure out why. So what changed? And I'd like to spend some very few minutes on what I call the strategic management of public policies. So I'd like to take a sort of a different view on some public policy issues. So I try to be in the feet of a management scholar, because I think we can gather some interesting insights from other disciplines other than I mean political sciences or even economics. What do you see on the left-hand side of this slide is a sort of production function of a public policy, of a public administration. So we have the factors of production, so very loosely speaking, the capital, I mean private and public capital maybe, and even labor. And today we have been discussing a lot. I mean, we spent hours discussing on we need to increase the quality of institutions, we need to change institutions, we need to do a lot of things. So what do you see on those wheels? Human capital and organization is what I think is sort of TFP of a public administration. So what is the human capital and how the station is organized? This morning, Ricardo said that, okay, over the past years, especially in Italy, the concept of improving the capacity of public administration was misconceived by public administration itself. So they started to hire new people. So when you hire new people, of course, you are increasing the quantity, the stock of labor, so you're increasing factors production, and maybe you are also increasing human capital. But in my view, I think we still need something to do in terms of organization. So we need to reorganize institutions. So what Guido said, that institutions cannot be changed in the short run, is very true, especially in Southern Europe. So when very long-lasting effect of history, but also some legal barriers cannot, I mean, act against the institutional change, if you want. But I still think that we can reorganize bureaucracy. So we can reorganize administration. So a sort of internal organization of institutions. Maybe it's a spurious observation, but I'd like to share with you my view. I said that during the 90s, some regions in the South were sort of best practices in Europe for spending and for delivering outcomes instead of outputs funded by cohesion policy. There's something changed. The big change I've observed, especially in the South, was that the managing authorities of structural funds changed their position within the internal organization of institution, and they became more, let's say, prone to were more politically, let's say, driven. So instead of breaking the chain of managing authorities with respect to politics, we have increased the political pressure on managing authorities. And I think that this is something we need to take into account. Maybe managing authorities need to be a little bit more independent with respect to politics. This is a very, it's a very small change in terms of bureaucracy, in terms of legal issues, but still it's a big political push to increase the delivery of cohesion policy in itself. The second point is that if we take the strategic management perspective, so the perspective of management scholars, we need to have some KPI, some indicators telling us whether or not our strategy is delivering. And as Guido, but also other people said this morning, we need a lot of evidence. We need some evaluations. And there's no doubt that counterfactual evaluation has played a crucial role over the past decades. We have a wealth of evidence. The problem we have with the counterfactual evaluation, especially in the vast majority of studies I've seen, is that they have an average treatment effect, which is very local. So it's very hard to find what Guido said, the external validity of our evidence. But still, we do need to have a sort of database of evaluations. And this is very important because, in Italy, but especially in Europe, we have a lot of heterogeneity. And we need to know what is the transportability, so the potential effect of a given policy when it is transported from one place to another. And the reason why I'm using this transportability word is not only because I'm very interested into transport, actually, but also because it's a very nice concept proposed by Judea Pearl, who is actually an information scientist. And we have two types of transportability, so the knowledge of past experiences. We have the trivial transportability and the conditional transportability. The trivial transportability is what, in the best cases, has informed current public policies and does not deliver it. It didn't work. We need to focus on conditional transportability. So we need to combine information from, let's say, econometric analysis and the local conditions. So we still need to have some analytics behind this database we need to have in terms of other, the effect of the same policies applied in other places. The last point I'd like to touch is on green policies and regarding the transportability issue. We know that in the vast majority of cases, environmental policies produce inequality. So they act against cohesion. Of course, we can use some rhetorics to justify some specific policies, some green policies, but we need to be aware of the fact that we are potentially increasing inequality within our systems, within cities, between cities and rural areas, across regions. What we have observed before the COVID crisis in France, it's a clear case of an environmentally efficient policy, so increasing the price of fuel, delivering a politically adverse effect. This is something we need to be very careful on. So also for this case, especially for the case of green policies, also that the paper by Riccardo and Mara shows regarding digital innovation, we need to be aware that we are potentially increasing disparities within our system. But if we, in my view, if we focus on reorganization, so the internal organization of institutions, it's something we can do in the short run. This is something along with the transportability issues. So having a sort of European-wide facility, reporting and organizing information coming from case studies, qualitative case studies, from counterfactual evaluation and whatever evaluation. So if we have these two elements, we may probably push the shift from outputs to outcomes, which is probably the leitmotif of today. So thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Marco. I think there's a rich set of insights that we've received. Lewis started off with a very clear statement: we can't continue with business as usual, and particularly as far as the green transition is concerned, which needs to be driven with massive investment. But as Guido pointed out, massive public expenditure does not necessarily deliver, and there are experiences in parts of Italy where the effects of investment, certainly under cohesion policy, has been short term, and so of course reforms are particularly important, and this is certainly a leitmotif of the Recovery and Resilience Plan: reforms plus investment. In terms of the way we go about managing it, Varinha's point about governance matters, I think, ran through virtually all of the panelists' contributions. Vassilis talked about the importance of synergies and coordination, the careful use of conditionalities, and capacity. And that theme of building institutional capacity was something that was also developed by Guido, focusing particularly on local institutional capacity, that Varinha also picked up. Several of the speakers talked about the importance of place-based policies, of regionally differentiated responses, but the regions need to be empowered, as Varinha said, and it's important that there is partnership vertically and horizontally. And in interesting development of institutional capacity, Marco just talked about just now the key issue of human capital, but particularly bringing in fresh thinking, the transportability of knowledge, but very much in the context of a reorganized approach to institutions. Well, let's delve into some of these points in a bit more detail. And firstly, on this recognition that has been established for some time in the literature about the importance of a regional differentiated or place-based response. Lewis, I suppose a question for you is, why is the RRF not more tailored to places? I mean, I think there are 19 national regional resilience and recovery plans that have been approved and mostly adopted up till now, but you can see that in the Italian one, for example, as I think Guido implied, there's a target of concentrating at least 40% of investment in the south, so very much regionally focused. And while there is a pillar of social and territorial cohesion, you can see it more strongly in the Italian and the French national plans, where they're very much the territorial cohesion is very much an axis in those, and some of the others also refer to the relationship with cohesion policy. But what struck me is looking at all of the plans, there was this standard sentence towards the end, which runs along the line. It is to be encouraged that there is a balanced approach to investment, territorially balanced approach to investment. It's a standard sentence in, I think, every plan. But on the whole, one could struggle to see a strong commitment to place-based policies in many RRPs. And why is that? Would you agree with that, firstly, and why is that? Okay, we're not hearing you, Lewis, or I'm not hearing you. Nobody else. Okay. Okay. Maybe while Lewis is sorting out his, okay, we're not getting sound. Okay, and you've frozen now. Perhaps you could log in if you could hear us. Lewis, can you hear us? No. Okay. Well, let's. Vassilis, would you like to come in on that point? I think you had you indicated you wanted to come in there.
Thanks, John. Just covering for Luis, pretty much. I'm sure I won't reflect exactly what you would say. We usually disagree on these points, but I think, I mean, from my side, we shouldn't forget, of course, that the Recovery Resilience Fund is basically a political negotiation at the national level, at the European level between the member states. So these are national programs. And it would be, other than the fact that, you know, at the speed at which it happened, it kind of allows countries that want to incorporate, you know, within the mechanics, if you want, of the cohesion policy. Other than that, this is something that comes at the national level. We also heard in the morning by Eric von Berska and others that, you know, really what matters is not the investment component, it's the reform component. And the reform component is not regional. You know, you don't reform your pension system and your labor market at the local, regional level. So if the objectives, or if you want the conditionalities at the national level, then governments can be excused that they should allocate also the money non-spatially, not completely, of course, and there's a number of objectives, including territorial cohesion, both in the documents and in the practice, or I mean, you know, the programs. But this cannot possibly be the priority, because already there's too many priorities, and you cannot do green economy at the local level. I mean, you can do, I think, globally, act locally, but you know, you cannot pollute on one side and be green on the other side. So in some way, the nature of it, the reform component, the big targets, is national inevitably. I think Luis is back.
Yeah, sorry about a little technical issue there. I hope you can hear me now.
We can.
So on the you know, recovery and resilience programs, and why are they national? I think Vassilis made a couple of good points there, and of course we're looking at a very large amount of money that needs to be invested very quickly to really help us with this recovery, right? So the more criteria you attach to that funding, the harder it becomes to invest that quickly. But despite the fact that we're looking at maybe national plans, I would argue that a lot of the benefits of actually reforming institutions and structural reforms are going to go to less developed regions. In the case of Italy, you know, there's a consensus that it's the lack of fast and efficient and transparent institutions that's held back the Mezzogiorno. If you look at the delays in the justice system, it's primarily concentrated in the south, not exclusively, but I think if we manage to, you know, get rid of that backlog, this will disproportionately benefit the regions where that backlog was long, and that was typically in the less developed regions. So I actually am hopeful that despite the national focus of the reforms, the places that will benefit the most are the ones that can least afford delays, inefficiencies, lack of transparency, or even downright corruption, right? So I'm hoping that this kind of big push to do this quickly, to do this well, to do this online, can really also contribute to cohesion, despite no requirement to really have a large targeted amount of investment allocated to those regions.
Okay, thanks very much, both Vassilis and Luis. Just staying on the question of institution building. Guido, you talked about local institutional capacity, a local institutional quality and capacity building. Could you sort of maybe elaborate on what you see as the priorities there? I mean, institutional quality covers a broad range of issues, and we've heard some of them. But what do you see as the priorities? And Varinha, you might want to come in on that as well, given what you said. Guido, do you want to?
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. Actually, the local quality of the institution seems to be, a relevant driver. And this is true also from an econometric point of view. If you play around with the regression and try to understand what are the determinants of, varying degrees of effectiveness or the varying degrees of economic development, and then you put in your regression some index of local institutional quality, you explain really a lot. And also, if you try to look at some programs that we have already implemented in the past, one funny thing about the cohesion policy is that we have already experimented a lot of programs, okay? But probably we had not capitalized enough on the results of this program. For instance, in the programming period 2007-2013, in Italy, there was this fabulous program that was called Obiettivi di Servizio, okay? And there was a way to make local authorities, okay, responsible for the outcome that they were able to reach in terms of public service, okay, and they will get extra money if they were able to reach some pre-specified outcome, okay? And the program worked up to a point, and then we tried with a bunch of people back at the Bank of Italy to understand why that program that at that point was a very modern and program at the frontier of the knowledge. Why did it work only partially? And we discovered that actually, and some of these lessons can still be relevant now, we discovered that first of all, regions with a good institutional quality as it measured by a bunch of indicators, and now we can measure it imperfectly. What we can measure the local institutional quality. Local institutional quality was I was saying the main driver. Okay, meaning that when there is locally good administrations, then the program were basically on track. While when there was no a good quality for the local administration, there was basically nothing to do. Okay, there was no way to move. Okay, the provision of public services towards higher standards. We also find something that is very interesting, that can be interesting for the debate. For the current debate, because in that program we had some conditionality. Okay, Vassilis was mentioning that now the recovery plan is different from the national, from the usual standard cohesion policy, because we have some conditionality embedded in it. So this was also an issue that was touched this morning, and I was thinking about this sorts of conditionality, and I'm not really sure that I will like it 100%, and that I will say why. So first of all, we have lots of emphasis on internal conditionality, meaning procedural, meaning input conditionality. Okay, and we have no idea we don't have conditionality on the outcome. Okay, on the things that we are really interested in, that means basically growth and decarbonization. So this is good or this is bad? Well, in some cases this is very good. For instance, if we want to make sure that the money arrives at a reformed public administration, we want to have a law on that reformed public administration that is signed before the arrival of the money. So this is, I believe, a very good move. But in some other cases, I'm not sure that those elements of conditionality will really help. One point is that in some cases they will increase the rigidity. And this will be a problem, especially for badly designed programs. Okay, here my fear is that in the current version of the national plans, we still have a number of badly designed programs that we have to reform somewhere later on. For instance, that's just my one example. Think at the idea of having high-speed railways in the south. Okay, a lot of money. Italy puts a lot of money on having high-speed trains in the south. And the idea here is that you want to have two birds with one stone, because high speed might be good for growth. Okay, That's in our government idea. And high-speed train might be good also for decarbonization, because the idea is that people stop using cars and will use the train. Well, but at the same time, here we have many problems. First of all, the idea that there is a a strong link between transportation economic growth. It's something that the economic literature just does not support. You may have a look at the papers of Gilles Duranton and his co-authors, but there is no evidence that putting a highway or putting a given territory will increase the economic growth of that area. And there is also a nice paper by Borsati and Albalate that compare what happens in a nearby highway when you start having high-speed train on the train side, on the train side, and they basically find that there is no effect, but there is a positive effect on the traffic on the highway, while you want to have just the opposite effect. So, and also the other idea that people will start using high-speed train instead of the car is again not really supported by the empirical evidence, because if you look at the modal shift, okay, that is being estimated in the literature, so this modal shift is very little, has nothing to do with this modal shift that is there in the recovery plan. This is to say that in some cases we need to reform we need to change, okay, part of the program that we have in the recovery plan. In this case, I was wondering what's going to happen with our milestones and with our targets. Probably they need to change, and probably there will not be the incentive mechanism that we have in mind. And also, just a final point, in some cases local administrations they behave in a bizarre way when they have some targets. Okay, for instance, some targets are very specific, so the government at the local level will devote all the effort to reach that target, while we can have some other important aspects, okay, of for instance, a public sector provision that are not considered under the target, and so they just forget about that. And they also can arbitrage their effort between programs for which we have a target, for which they will get money, and programs for which they will not get money. So that's it.
Okay, thanks very much. I'd like to come back on this issue of conditionalities, which I think Vassilis might also want to come in, because he was also a little skeptical, I think, about the use of conditionalities. But before that, Varinha, would you like to come in on this issue of what you mean by institutional capacity? What do you see as the priorities? Because it covers such a broad range of factors.
Yeah, it does. And actually, I think there are about 3 things that I've jotted down that I'd like to share. And it's institutional capacity at multiple levels, at the national level, and then also at the subnational level, and really at the implementation level. So if we look at sort of just this institutional capacity in general, and it links to quality governance, because there's some studies that we've noted that show that when you have, or show that it's really possible to generate savings on, for example, infrastructure projects, which we know that cohesion policy and other funds go to fund quite a bit. So you can generate about 40% savings on infrastructure projects when your project selection, delivery, and the management of existing assets are more effective. To do that, you need quality institutions. You also can avoid sort of a loss in the potential gains of public investment. So what some studies are also showing is that there's about a 30% of potential gains from public investment can be lost due to inefficiencies in public investment processes. So again, to avoid that requires a certain amount of management capacity and quality governance. And so that leads me to the second point that I wanted to share with respect to subnational governments. That subnational governments for example, an OECD and Committee of the Regions study that we've done together with the Committee of Regions highlight that there are some really critical challenges at the subnational level for this capacity dimension and this governance dimension to work right. And among them is sort of a lack of long-term strategic planning capacity and a lack of sorry, I'm looking at my notes at the same time and needing to make it larger. A lack of their adequate own expertise as well. They tend to have to go outside for that expertise. Data issues are another issue. And also a lack of political will to work across levels of government. So those are all institutional capacity issues that affect subnational governments. There are also some framework conditions, and those they may be able to work on, but there are some framework conditions that affect the institutional capacity to act, and sometimes institutional quality that they are less able to work on. And that includes, for example, administrative burden and red tape. It includes procurement procedures that can be very lengthy, and also a disconnect between, and this goes to the need for a more tailored approach, a disconnect between local or regional needs and those that are given priority by the national level. The final point that I'd like to make on this capacity issue is that you have this sort of, we're talking about capacity and institutional quality very broadly in terms of government. But if we look at EU funding and especially cohesion policy funds, you also, and this comes back to Marco's presentation, you also have the managing authorities. And you cannot forget the managing authorities because they're the ones through whose hands the money passes to go to the beneficiaries. And if they don't have adequate capacity to manage their funds from an administrative or operational or strategic point of view, it's going to be, let's say, harder to very effectively use those funds. So I think that kind of wraps up for me that institutional capacity building. You have to look at different levels of government. You have to look at different types of institutions and know where you can actually have an impact or not.
Okay, thanks very much, Varinha. As you said, this links to what Marco was saying about knowledge transfers, knowledge flows. There was and Marco, I wonder if you could elaborate perhaps on the mechanisms of transferability, because it links with a question we've got in the chat from Teodoro Dogaru, who asks about encouraging knowledge transfers between high-skilled workers and whether there should be a conditionality for partnerships between Northwest and Southeast Europe, particularly for national projects to enhance knowledge spillovers and transfer of best practice. Is that a kind of mechanism that you would be thinking about, or what other sort of mechanisms for transportability did you have in mind?
Well, thanks for your question, and I'm afraid my answer is very loose in a sense that I try to work with the numbers. So in my view, and also in my experience, and I will tell you in a moment what type of experience I have, the managing authorities especially, but in general institutions are are not very interested into numbers. So the type of transportability I have in my mind is that, okay, we have some case studies, and those case studies of policy implementations have been studied through numbers, so econometrics, have been studied from a qualitative perspective. Can we imagine a methodology to combine information regarding those 10 case studies and try to infer what is the external validity of the outcomes we have observed over those 10 regions? We do have some analytical methodologies from a statistical perspective to combine this information, and we can transfer this knowledge to managing authorities. So the type of knowledge transfer I have in my mind, but it's a very personal view, is more analytical in a sense. So it's much more related on numbers, more related on what works, as Henry Waverman was saying this morning, what works and what it doesn't work. So it's probably not necessarily related to partnerships, which is probably something that used to happen over the past decades in terms of sharing of best practices. But the sharing of best practices, in my view, is not enough. So it's what in the literature is called trivial transportability. So we observe what happens in a place and we think that this exactly the same thing will happen in our place, in our region. And in my view, this is not enough. So we need to condition. I mean, it's another type of a conditionality in a sense, but we need to provide some conditions for what we observe in some region and what we can observe in our region. If I can, I will also spend one very few words on a very loose thought, which is what we mean, or what the European Commission means for evaluation, which is very different with respect to social scientists think that evaluation is. So far, managing authorities have been very interested into a very qualitative evaluation first. Second, a type of evaluation, which is not evaluation per se in social sciences. So it's much more some contextual analysis, what is happening around the public policy. Our research center, The Green at Bocconi University, we are evaluating the national program for infrastructure in the south of Italy, and we are the evaluators, let's say. The type of evaluation we make for the managing authorities are very qualitative and are very related to what is happening in the transport sector in the south of Italy. So it's completely unrelated to what we, with respect to the outcomes of the public policies. So on this, I think that also, it's also a matter of wording in a sense. And of course, it's a matter of substance in terms of evaluation. And of course, I think we have a bunch of ex-ante evaluation regarding cohesion policy funded programs, especially carried out by means of Keynesian models. We have very few ex-post evaluation conducted at a central level. And I think that one of the prerequisites for this knowledge diffusion or knowledge transfer from one region to another is to have what I said, a facility. So a sort of data bank of case studies, of econometric analysis and whatever, and also some methodological tip to use that type of information, because those methodological tips are very crucial if we try to be in, let's say, in the bureaucrat feet, which is, I mean, usually a public servant is not necessarily a social scientist. So he needs or she needs to be sort of instructed on how to use information. And this, I think, it's extremely crucial also for the delivery of public policy in general. Just one last sentence on what we mean for local institutions, also in the words of Guido, but also this is something related to what Varinha said. Local institutions are two different animals with respect to what we are discussing today. We have institutions providing the socioeconomic context, for example, the tribunals Lewis was mentioning in the south of Italy. I mean, and those are the subject of the reforms. Those are especially the subject of reforms for the recovery plans. And then we have managing authorities. Both are extremely important, but we have two different channels to act on those two types of institutions. In my view, for the delivery of programs, managing authorities, so the internal organization of public policy, are much more important than the others, or sorry, much better. They are not much more important, but they are extremely important, but we can act very easily and fastly on them than on acting on the length of processes of other institutions.
Okay, thank you very much, Marco. Lewis, I think you want to come in on the issue of local administrative capacity.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about different levels of government and the variation between the situation in different parts of a country. But I think there are two elements for me that are really important when considering administrative capacity at the subnational level. And the first one is, do these levels actually have significant autonomy? You know, whether at the regional or the local level, are these actually strong political actors with the capacity to shape their policies, to identify their investment priorities, or are they more executive agencies where, you know, all the key decisions have been taken by a higher level? And within the EU, we see a large amount of variation on that front. We see some countries with relatively small regions with very little capacity and very little to say. And then we see other places with maybe larger regions in terms of population and a significant, sometimes a very strong historic role in terms of a political actor. So I think that's key. The other thing is, you know, I think for some of these policies, we really need to have a bit of a critical mass. And there, you know, a municipality is just the wrong level, right? If you're trying to address certain issues, you're going to have to address the regional level as a minimum. And it's important to address certain issues really at a functional level, so that you don't just have one policy for the city center and another policy for the suburbs or the commuting zone. So I think there's an issue there. So it's not, first question is, how much autonomy do these levels have? And the second question for me is, how large of a population do they serve, right? France is known for its tiny sizes of its municipalities. And I am concerned that when it comes to delegating activities to municipalities, that they are often just too small to really have the expertise and the administrative capacity to do those. And then the last question is, of course, given their size, given their autonomy, do they actually have, you know, our best interests at heart? Are they trying to help the public good or their private interests, right? And so, but it's a cascade, right? And it's not just a question of, are they corrupt or are they incompetent? It's also a question of, are these actually serving a sufficiently large population that they can have a large enough staff, that they can have a certain amount of expertise, that they can have a team of people working on these issues? And I think we need to see that separately from, say the quality of the institutions. I think the scale of the institutions we're looking at is important, and their political autonomy.
Okay, thanks for that, Lewis. I think if we've got time, it would be interesting to come back to the issue of citizen engagement, because there is a conflict often between what, if you like, elites, decision makers are saying is important for an area and what people feel is important for their local quality of life. But let's perhaps come back to that. I'd like to go back to the issue that we started with about place-based issues in the RRF plans, and a comment or question that Dimitri Korpakis raises in the chat about the risk of reinforcing the widespread view that location-blind policies are more efficient, and the risk of relegating smart specialization strategies to what he calls second-rate old-school thinking. Vassilis, you'd like to come in on that point, I think.
Yes, thanks, John. Yes, I think that's a very nice question by Dimitris Korpakis. Indeed, I think one of the casualties, if you want, of the flood of money that is coming with the next generation EU budget is the fact that you know, the focus on this idea of really place-based in the sense of smart specialization, trying to find, you know, your latent comparative advantages. How do you build your, you know, how do you direct your diversification into new activities that can take you to a different level qualitatively in terms of economic development, which I think is what underpins the smart specialization strategy, the logic of it. This definitely in the RRF is being lost, and not only on the financing side and how the money is administered or how the programs are, as we're saying, very national and not kind of more decentralized. But I think also in the priorities, because of course, in the past, in the very recent past, you could decide whether you go green or digital or non-digital, analog or whatever it is in your own region, as long as it made sense, based on some sort of evidence base about your comparative advantages, your capacities, your location, the specialization of your competitors, and things like that. Whereas now there's this very much kind of top-down objective on going for green and digital, and I'm all for green, a bit less so for digital, but also inevitably also yes for digital. But this doesn't change the fact that this is top-down, and in a way that can also lead to bad old habits like box ticking and trying to fit too many things in a narrative that justifies the receipt of money. I note, for example, we heard in the morning that the program in Italy has 132 investments and 58 reforms. I'm pretty sure any reform that was there in any drawer and shelf, was resurrected in order to be included in the program, as we heard also, including pension reform. And I want to say this thing, I know I deviate from the smart specialization, but I want to get on this thing about conditionality because it's very close to heart. But of course, we need reforms on the things that enable the delivery of the interventions we want to have. So yes, if you want to have, from transport expenditure to digitalization to whatever, you need to have the right institutional infrastructure. So you need to do the reforms that would enable that. That may involve some also product market deregulation, but definitely institutional reforms from public administration to judiciary to whatever. But then when you extend that and say, okay, it has to be consistent with the European semester, the country-specific recommendations, the broader policy guidelines of the European Union, hence your pension system should have the strong third pillar. This is not enabling necessarily my digitalization, like running a high-speed internet in remote areas. This probably creates a lot of costs, political and other costs, but I have to draw some money in order to deal with them because I have to do side payments, or I have to somehow compensate the losers of the reforms. So I think this is a problem that this kind of top-down thing becomes then a kitchen sink where you can put all your reforms and all your objectives. In that regard, but to me, I agree with what I think the question by Dimitris implies, that this is a step back from what we did with smart specialization, because despite the possible many problems of the implementation of smart specialization or the local design of it, at least there was this very, very precise focus on evidence-based understanding, involving stakeholders, understanding capacities and potentials, and trying to develop a local strategy that is both smart but also locally relevant. And I think that is a great loss with the, side consequence of how we're dealing with the crisis, the pandemic and the climate crisis.
Okay, thank you very much, Vassilis. Sticking with the theme of conditionalities, Guido, could perhaps come back to you. I mean, the title of this workshop is Lessons from Cohesion Policy. You seem to be referring to lessons for cohesion policy in implying that we need to rethink the approach to conditionalities within cohesion policy in terms of having more outcome-related conditions. Were you implying something more like the Recovery and Resilience Fund approach that links expenditure to achievements in some form, or what was your thinking about that?
Thank you, John. First of all, let me react a little bit to the things that Vassilis was saying before. I do understand that structural reform is not the whole part of the story, okay? But one thing that I want to say is that we do not have to underestimate the importance of structural reform. It's very difficult to measure what's the impact of structural reforms, for instance, of GDP. This is an exercise that we have done at the Bank of Italy. And for instance, we have estimated that the structural reform that has been done in this country from 2011 to 2017 have contributed a lot to the GDP growth of my country. The number is that without the reforms, and this is a paper by Chapana and others, the GDP in 2019 would have been from 3 to 6% lower. For a country that doesn't grow, that was Italy before the pandemic, this is a huge gain, and I'm sure that this plus from 3 to 6% is not concentrated only in the north of Italy. So I'm sure that the benefits they were considering the judiciary reform that have been introduced. They were considering liberalization in the service sector. So I'm sure that a big share of that gains have accrued to the south of Italy. So having said that, I don't want to say that we don't need a regional policy, that everything will be taken care at the level of structural reform, but please do not underestimate that probably, we first need some, structural reform, and then we have to rethink about our regional policy. Because we necessarily have to rethink of something that has not worked. Okay, there is no choice about it. On John on conditionality. Well, I have really a mixed feeling about it. On one side, well, I see that conditionality can provide, for instance, local actors, okay, some more leverage to put in place the right policies. And at the same time, if we look at the actual experience of conditionality that we have had, at least when we talk about regional policy, for instance, the example that I was mentioning before of the obiettivi di servizio in Italy, we see that basically conditionality didn't work in a way that central government thought. And again, that was an outcome-based conditionality. Okay, the targets were something like increase scholarization in the workforce, increase the number of pupils that will have a daycare facility or something like that. So I'm very well, I have a mixed feeling on the type of conditionality that is in the recovery plan. So if one says, well, we don't worry about the performance, don't worry about reaching our target because we have a conditionality. Well, I'm not sure I will agree with that. It's kind of internal procedure conditional that might work for structural reforms, for laws, for regulation, but I don't think it's going to work a lot with the investment, okay, with the intervention, with program. That's, well, I acknowledge that I don't have a final word on that, and I apologize for that, but at this moment I really have a mixed feeling.
Thanks very much, Guido. We're coming into the last sort of 8 or 9 minutes now, but I'd just like to sort of pick up a question, Varinha, that you raised about trust or distrust of institutions, and some of that was touched on indirectly by Lewis, but if we look at the Eurobarometer statistics, and if we look at studies, we can see very wide differences across Europe. In some countries, local institutions are widely distrusted, national ones distrusted a bit less, and the EU trusted most or distrusted least. But we also see different patterns in other countries. What are your views on how you address this? I mean, obviously the solution is good governance, but which we're all trying to emphasize. But do you see what do you see as effective strategies?
So that's a very good question. It's a pretty loaded question as well, and I don't think I have any very clear answers yet. It's something actually that we're working on right now at the OECD, both at the national level, and also to understand better what some of those drivers of trust are at the regional level. So we have work at drivers of trust at a national level, drivers of trust at a regional level, and then how you can respond to them. But just very briefly, because we're just getting started with this work, at least with the regional level, one of the things that we're seeing is that, and this is also thanks to work done by Lewis and Neil Lee, is that there are certain things that really matter in regions, and it includes access to public services, access to education, access to health. It also includes access to jobs. And so when you have regions that are feeling forgotten, when they feel that they don't have that, they're not getting the same services as others, and they are facing unemployment, they're going to trust their institutions less. I mean, it seems obvious, but they do. Now, what are the policy responses? The problem is that the impact is very immediate, and the policy responses take a while to take root, because the policy responses kind of link to regional development. They link to looking at skills sets, looking at innovation, looking at what is the labor market responses. It also requires taking a look at how you address education, and how you keep people in a place if you need to, in order to then make sure you have sufficient critical mass. And I think that goes back to Lewis's point before about scale and at what scale you act. So I don't have a definitive answer on trust in government. Maybe, let me come back in a year and see what our studies have continued to show. But definitely policy interventions that are going to support greater education outcomes, better healthcare, and better access to health, education, and jobs is fundamental there.
Okay, thanks. That does sound really interesting work. Maybe at the next Good Governance conference that Lewis organizes, we can hear some more about that. But just as we get into the closing sessions, Marco, can I ask you about the same issue? Because I think you were I think recommending greater political independence, or if you like, less political influence in terms of policy interventions. Of course, if we know from the literature that political stability provides, in many contexts, for better implementation, not in all contexts, but in many. But is that what you were saying, that essentially that politicians should be kept out of the loop? And where does that leave us democratic accountability?
Yeah, thank you, of course. And well, this is quite a very extreme, but in a sense, yes. Well, in my view, of course, there should be some sort of political overview of the whole process. But the problem to me is more related to the implementation phase. In the implementation phase, I see the politics as sort of pollution, a sort of sandling the wheels of policy implementation. And I think that especially in this phase, politics needs to be taken out from the whole organization. I know it's very extreme, but what I can simply very observe, so it's an observational thing, it's probably spurious, I don't know this, but as far as managing authorities were kept out of the presidency of regions, they worked much more, they worked better than how they work nowadays under the ministry or under the president of, under the ministry within the government or under the president within the region. This is one thing. And I think also that politics is very related to trust, as also Varinha and you were saying, John. I mean, politics, I'm sorry, my children are back. I think that politics is very related to trust. I mean, we know that there are very strong correlation between good politicians and trust and between trust and good politicians. I think that's something we can do also on this. I think that I'm out of time. So
yes, okay, and particularly if your children are home, we should leave it there. Okay, we're now a minute away from closing. So let me just finish by thanking you all for a really rich and really interesting session. We now have concluding remarks by Nicola De Michaelis, Director at DG Regio. But thanks again, and we look forward to the final session. Thanks and goodbye from this session.